I'm not sure how it really came up in conversation, but I was acting as an election judge at a recent election in our town. And one of the women who was also working there, and it was kind of slow, made this statement about she could not believe that anyone wouldn't believe that the age of the earth was millions of years old. And this sort of struck me out of left field. And after kind of regrouping for a moment, I said, well, hey, I believe that the earth is young. I believe it's 6,000 years old. And the look on her face, she was floored. And I kind of, because it was out of the blue, I kind of stumbled around some reasons, like, there's plenty of evidence for that. It isn't so clear cut, but it wasn't a great response. But clearly, she did not want to try to present any evidence for that fact or have any discussion beyond that. She kind of kept me at arm's length the rest of the time. And so that and some other things going on prompted me to think that, it's time for me to really capture why I am a young earth creationist. And so this video will hopefully address that. Now, first off, you have three groups of people in this whole debate. First, you got the group of Christians who believe in Genesis 1 through 3 as being literal. 6 days of creation by God, rests on the seventh, and a global flood, and believe it as what happened. You got another group on the far other end, don't have time for God, totally naturalistic thinking, might be an atheist, believe in millions of years for the earth, billions of years, 13 billion for the universe, and just make fun of the other far group. Then you got this group in the middle that are Christians or, have some version of God, but are trying to bridge the gap between the 6-day literal creationists and the totally naturalistic evolutionists. And so they're saying, well, God did this, but maybe he did it over a long period of time, or I believe the other parts of the Bible, but I don't really believe that. Now, don't get me wrong, they're all Christian, and that's great, because believing in Jesus as your Savior is the thing that will save us and get us to heaven one day. And not believing that has some pretty dire consequences. So it's great that there are these two groups both believing in Jesus, but in my view, there's some risk by trying to be this compromising thing between the two groups on the outside. So this video is going to try to address that. So let me tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in the church, so in Sunday school heard stories about creation and Adam and Eve and the flood and things like that. So just, took it at face value. But also as a kid, I grew up on a farm. And so I learned a lot about animals and nature and being around plants and trees, and spent a lot of time out in nature. And also in doing so, my mom gave me a gift as a kid, and that was when it was raining out and there wasn't any lightning, she would let me go out and play in the mud. Now, we had a lot of puddles, and we had some trees that actually provided an opportunity for this too. But I could play in the water and see the power of water in action by moving, creating channels in the mud and the puddles, and seeing water flow and seeing it cut through and seeing it rearrange. And that really gave me this sense of how powerful water is. And then another thing came up. As a kid, I really struggled with what probably is a much later philosophical dilemma, and that is, what is nothing? How do you have nothing? Is what we see possible filling up this space, but how do you have an edge of our universe? Can you not have nothing is kind of this infinite loop that I got into. And it pointed me to God, because obviously God figured that out. But this dilemma of how do you not have nothing? I know it sounds like many negatives, but how do you have something that doesn't fill a space. It's difficult to explain, but that was a real struggle for me as a kid. And then my son has had this struggle when he was about the same age. We're talking like 5 or 6 years old here. His struggle was, why do people kill each other? Why do people get mad at each other, hate each other? Why is there war? All of those things. And, in my explanation to him, it would start with the thing he was concerned about. And it always got back to, enough iterations, it always came back to the problem of sin. And that people were sinful, and that status of being sinful caused all these human interactions to be scarred and messed up. Another thing that happened after when I was young was I accepted Jesus as my Savior at about the age of 8, 3rd grade, somewhere in there. So that was important. Now fast forward to middle school and high school. In middle school you're getting some geography, and you're getting geology mixed into science books, and hearing millions of years, and I didn't really think much about it at the time. And then also in high school I had to take biology. And so I was actually blessed by having a pretty bad biology teacher, because he was spouting off the millions of years, and I'm thinking, well, this is contrary to what I learned in church and Sunday school about God creating it and being a short time, because I'd gone through, I had read the Bible. I read the Bible from cover to cover in junior high and high school, and looking through it, the genealogies back in Genesis, and you can count them up, and you get 6, 7, 8,000 years, depending on some assumptions in there, but not millions of years. So I'm hearing my biology teacher confidently saying millions of years for the Earth. And so I started asking questions, and I did a terrible job at this. Don't get me wrong. I was terrible, and asked him about dating methods. Of, well, how do you know that this rock is millions of years? And his answers were so pathetic. He clearly couldn't give me an answer, and he never did. He never went and researched it, and never gave me a solid answer on, how did these dating methods work? And since then, I've gone back and looked at a lot of them, and there's a lot of assumptions you have to make of what did the original sample look like, what was the content of different things in that sample when you do that. And so it just made me realize that the emperor had no clothes. And so I really had a big question mark about the whole millions of years thing, given his answers. But yet I hadn't really had a huge amount of reinforcement of the 6 days of creation in my church either. So I did read the Bible cover to cover, so I got the big picture of that. And fortunately in college, being an engineer, I didn't have to take the life sciences. I didn't have to take biology. I didn't have to take organic chemistry. I didn't have to take those more evolutionary science classes. I took chemistry, I took physics, and those were pretty safe. So what to do? So they had this conflict going on, millions of years, 6 days creation, 6,000-year-old Earth. So then it comes down to a Bible class as an adult, and we're talking about these sort of topics. And I realized at that time that I was a Young Earth Creationist. I hadn't really heard that term yet, but that was what I was. So let me go through the first few chapters of Genesis and just kind of point some things out as we go through those. And then I'm going to talk about geology and some other different science disciplines at a much lesser degree level, just to kind of explain how I got to be confident in being a Young Earth Creationist. So the beginning of the Bible is Genesis. Chapter 1 goes through what are called the 6 days of creation. So I believe it's a 24-hour day. And let's just read it at face value at this point and go from there. So, day 1, God makes the heavens and the earth. It's formless and it's dark. And the Spirit is moving over the waters. So, could be Father, Son, and Spirit, could be just Holy Spirit, but there's energy, there's activity there over creation. God makes light that same day. Now, the sun and the moon aren't there yet, but we have light. And God declares it a day. Could just be he's doing that because of it being 24 hours, or he's doing something with the light that makes it be day and night. But nonetheless, that's day one. Day two, he creates the firmament and divides the waters from the heavens to the waters on the earth. Each of these days he declares it as good, by the way. Day three, we get dry ground, plants and trees, vegetation. Day four, we get the sun and the moon and the stars. So some folks say you can't have a day without the sun. Let's just still say it's 24 hours. Day five is sea creatures and birds. Day six is animals, people, Adam and Eve, and they're made in the image of God. And he makes them male and female. So those are pretty important things for our culture right now. We're made in the image of God. We're made male and female. And we're also supposed to have dominion over creation. So over the animals and over the land. And then day seven, God rests. Does God really need to rest? Well, I believe, as many people say, that these 7 days of creation are showing the framework of how God wants us to live. So 6 days to work, 1 day to rest. That's a pretty good plan, I think. Particularly when you look at our culture now where we got, 24/7, everything is moving, going. You're expected to be working all the time. It's nice that God put that rest in there. So what are some other takeaways from this first week? Because it seems like our culture that is anti-God really wants to destroy everything that is set up in chapter 1. So first you got people. We're in the image of God. That means we are valuable. We are different from the animals. When you're made in the image of God, it means you're special. So, things like abortion, killing the unborn, those are human beings. They're a unique creature, distinct from its mother, from that moment of fertilization. And it's sad when I see pastors in our churches pretty much ignoring that issue. Abortion is a horrible thing. And so it destroys the lives of those unborn, but also is just damaging to the moms and dads that would have been parents to those kids. So, when our churches ignore it, it almost makes it look like abortion isn't just the sin we can't talk about, but it's also unforgivable, and that is just not the case. God loves life. He's the creator of life. So abortion is one of those things in our culture that just want to destroy that creature that was in the image of God. Another thing is we are to be stewards of creation. We don't have to preserve it into its original state and never use it. I think we're instructed to use and have dominion over nature. But that means we also care for animals, not abusing animals. Use them, take care of nature. Be wise about it. But as far as, crazy environmentalism or crazy animal rights, where animals have just as much or more rights than human beings, that's just wrong from what we see in this foundational chapter of Genesis. God also makes male and female. And these days, there's trans and bi and lesbian and homosexual, gay, all these different genders and sexual orientations. There's one medical organization that had defined 50 sexual orientations. I don't know what all of them are, but God pretty much lays down, the first couple in marriage, make them male and female. And then we can fast forward to Mark 10:6, where Jesus is saying, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So Jesus, who believe in Jesus, is reinforcing what happened in Genesis 1 when God made humans male and female. All right, so I just wanted to bring up Exodus 20:11. Here, this is a book written by Moses, just as Genesis is written by Moses. But in verse 11, we're in the middle of the Israelites getting the Ten Commandments. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So here Moses is pretty clear that it's a 24-hour day during God's creation, and that reinforcing that's what it was. So now let's look at a little bit more about the early Genesis books. Genesis 2 is a more intimate description of creation, particularly how Eve was taken from a rib of Adam. And Adam gets to name all the animals. Work is a positive thing. And we get traditional marriage, one man, one woman, equal roles, but just different roles. So that's gotten corrupted in our culture along the way too. Genesis 3, Adam and Eve sin. They don't follow what God instructed them to do. They ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They gained death. They gained separation from God. It's not an immediate death. It's a separation, spiritual death, so to speak. But then later on there's a physical death. There's strife between the sexes, pain in childbirth. Work now is hard. Thorns infest the ground. Paradise is lost. But the good news is, in verse 15, there's a promise of a Savior who's going to bruise the head of Satan. Well, it's going to bruise his heel. So, a great promise there. And then looking at Genesis 4, we get our first murder. Adam and Eve have many children. Cain and Abel are two of them. And Cain's jealous of Abel's good relationship with God. His sacrifice was accepted. Cain's was not. And so Cain murders Abel. We also learn about these ancient people that they were already working in bronze and iron at that time. So these folks were smart. Yeah, the curse had happened, but they also were not as subject to all the diseases that we have acquired since then. Also haven't had all the genetic damage to our DNA that's happened over many centuries. And so they're smart and they're pretty healthy. And then let's go look on to chapter 5. Okay, so looking at Genesis 5, we have a long genealogy. And going from the different ages of everybody and when they have children, you can kind of come up with a number in the 6,000 to 7,000 year range, along with a few other assumptions about things beyond the Old Testament, for an age of the earth to be about 6,000 to 7,000 years old, using these ages of people. Now you notice that the ages of the people are very long, with Methuselah being the longest at 969 years old. And by today's standards, we go, oh my gosh, living to nearly 1,000 years old, that's crazy. How would people do that? Well, a couple of things. First is these folks were much closer to the original creation. Their DNA hadn't been damaged by environmental things, all sorts of things. So got that going for them. They also were protected by this firmament that's brought up in Genesis 1. So what did that do? Well, all that UV radiation, gamma radiation that we get from the sun filtered out. Also, the Earth's temperature was very uniform, so it was a very good environment. So, you know, there and you know, the evolutionary viewpoint is there's this tropical world in the ancient world for evolutionists. So that actually matches up quite well. It was warm everywhere. So tropical plants are found as fossils near the poles today. There's things like mammoths found in permafrost, and they've got tropical plants in their bellies. It also provided for very large creatures. So, like for instance, lizards can get bigger depending on their environment. So huge lizards would have been possible, big bugs, big turtles, all sorts of creatures that are much larger than what we would have today because of this environment. And you can sometimes see those in museums or on the internet. You can see, a turtle, a skeleton that's, taller than a man, just because of that environment. Also, the oxygen levels today on the Earth are about 21%. Well, back at this time, going through and looking at air trapped in amber, the belief is that it was probably 32%, so 50% more back in the early world. So this environment basically acts as what we'd call a hyperbaric chamber today, which are used for dealing with somebody who's scuba diving and has decompression issues, but also for healing and for dealing with some severe infections. So the Genesis world for these early people was ideal for life, and so they had long lifespans. Then we get into Genesis 6. We find out the population is growing, but also lawlessness and corruption are rampant. We hear about the Nephilim, the giants, and you don't hear much about that now, but in verse 4, it's talking about them, and we don't really have giants anymore today. But later on in 2 Samuel and in Chronicles, and we've all heard the story of David and Goliath. Goliath's this big guy. Well, he's believed to be about 9 foot. So, and probably not anybody skinny, but a solid 9 foot. He was the Philistine hero, so to speak. So anyway, you've got giants. And I even remember as a kid, at our local grocery store, this guy came, and he was 8 or 9 feet tall. And even though I was pretty, as a kid and small, he was just huge. So not out of the ordinary. Even by today's standards, there are a few people who are very tall. We also meet Noah for the first time. And he's a guy that is righteous in God's sight. And so he's going to have a much bigger role now in chapter 7. So now we're in Genesis 7. God has instructed Noah to build an ark because he's going to flood the planet, needs Noah to save his family, save all the animals. So Noah is a wealthy guy. He has the resources to do it. His 3 sons help, as well as probably a whole lot of people that he hired. So the ark, by the dimensions in Genesis 7, are such that this ark has the same proportions as a modern ocean liner, and actually pretty close to the same size. Now, these were smart people. We think they're stupid from the past, but actually they're quite smart, and so this was something that they could do. They probably also had, it was made with 3 decks, had probably plenty of systems inside to handle storage of water, storage of food for the animals and the people, ways to deal with poop of the animals. And God brings a pair of all the animals to go into the ark, a male and female of each kind, not species, but kind. So you'd only need 2 cats, you'd only need 2 dogs. And from what we know about speciation now, this isn't a big far-fetched thing. Just look at the abundance of dog breeds that have come out in my own lifetime. And so plenty of genetic diversity from these early cats, early dogs, early horses that make all the different flavors of cats and dogs that we have today. And the ark, being the size of an ocean liner, had plenty of room for all the animals. It's often said, oh, you can never fit everything in. Well, if you did have to take every species of every kind of animal, yes, it wouldn't fit. But if you don't need full-grown elephants, you might take juvenile elephants. And in the ark, it's going to be dark. They're going to be sleeping a lot of the time. So didn't need a zoo-like facility to be able to handle all these animals. And God probably sent a pair of each kind that had good genes still, so those animals could reproduce later and create all these different kinds. And then God closes the door. He's left it open for a time before that to allow other people to come in, but nobody else takes Noah up on his offer. So closes the door, starts raining for 40 days, The fountains of the deep open. So water from below the earth is coming up. Probably a lot of volcanic activity, a lot of earthquake activity, a turbulent world. So Noah and the animals and the dinosaurs, by the way, too, would have been on the ark, but not a full-grown T-Rex, obviously. So all the animals on the ark have a year-long ride. Probably was not an easy time being cooped up for a year, but this ocean liner type ark was optimized for both comfort and strength with the proportions that are described in Genesis. And depending on what a cubit is believed to be, there's a certain range that they expect. It's a big ship. So worldwide flood. So what else happens? The firmament, basically, the way it was pre-flood is now changed. It's destroyed. We still have an atmosphere and all of that, but we don't have that protective layer on planet Earth like they did. And so, age of people, it's going to drop here. Mountains are covered. All the plants, all the animals, all the air-breathing animals are destroyed. Now, the flood is reinforced by Jesus in Luke 17, 25 through 27, and Matthew 24, 37 through 38. He's talking about the flood and confirming that flood happened. Hebrews 11:7, 1 Peter 3:20, 2 Peter 2:5, 2 Peter 3:5-7, all talking about these types of events. So here's the Matthew 24, 37 through 38 verse. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. So Jesus clearly believed that the flood was a real thing. So what happens in Genesis 8? God plugs the fountains of the deep. He starts a wind to blow over the waters. Things start to dry out. The ark, it rests on the top of a mountain. Now, the whole earth, the highest mountains were covered with water. I think it says 15 cubits, so 20 or 30 feet. Quite a bit of water over the top of the mountains. Everything died. But now the ark's on a mountaintop. They send some birds out to check and see what the conditions are out there. And eventually when the bird doesn't come back, or it comes back with an olive branch in its beak, they know that it's time to go check out what's happening. So they sacrifice some of the clean animals to God for thanking him for their safety through all of the flooding. And we hear about seasons now in the sense of hot and cold for the seasons. Things will continue on, but things aren't quite the same as what they were prior to the flood. And so we hear of cold for the first time. But remember, prior, everything had been very tropical. So in Genesis 9, Noah and his family are on dry ground. God blesses them, tells them to be fruitful and multiply. They are allowed to eat animals now. Prior to this, they were vegetarians. But animals also now fear people. So, kind of know where that's at. They had the first rainbow, because now they're going to have rain. The firmament is pretty much gone. So in that rainbow is the promise that God is never going to flood the earth again. It's going to come fire next time around. So there's going to be no more worldwide floods. Not that there won't ever be floods locally. We had our own flood here in 2013 where I live, and it was devastating, and it was just a regional kind of flood, and still many people were killed. We're still dealing with the destruction of a local flood. So you can imagine what a worldwide flood would look like. So we're now getting rain. The earth has to adapt to this now cold, potentially, or warm environment, depending on where you're at, because this firmament's gone, keeping the temperature consistent. An ice age is going to come. It's a muddy world. All that soil that was stirred up from huge waves from the worldwide flood are now redeposited over the whole earth in layer after layer after layer. And you can see this in any time that you're in the mountains, for example. You just see layer of layer and layer and layer of rock on top of one another. And the color variation is amazing on just, so you can see that sort of thing. But more about that later. Genesis 10, more genealogy of Noah's family. In Genesis 11, everyone in the world at that time, they're all one people, they're all living together, and they're all speaking one language. And arrogance raises its ugly head, and imagine that, and they decide they're going to build a huge tower into the sky. And so God says, enough of this, and confuses their languages. So what's going to happen? People who are speaking the same language start forming groups, and they start separating from the location where they were building this tower. So we get people groups from that. Races are what we typically use for these groups of people, but people groups is really a better term for it. So you have, say, Asian people who have certain physical characteristics. You have Northern European people, certain characteristics. African people, certain characteristics. Just, very general terms here. But certain genetic characteristics of these groups of people become more dominant as they're separated from all those other folks. And so we call those races today. But these are really people groups. So whether it's blonde hair, or brown hair, dark skin, or light skin, we're all one people. So from God's point of view, all the racism that people scream about anymore is all ridiculous. We're one people. This also fits pretty well with what people see in archaeology, where various languages kind of pop up out of nowhere in what they dig up. Full-blown languages, not this long evolution of language where we're gaining words and pictures and things like that. It's full-blown languages from the get-go. So that fits really quite well with Genesis 11. We get more genealogy to the point where we get to a guy named Abraham, who's going to be a forerunner of Jesus. So that's kind of what I want to focus on in Genesis. Next, let's look at some of the sciences, particularly geology, and how that fits in with my view of a young Earth. So let's look at the field of geology. Now, I'm not a geologist, but I travel, particularly the national parks, and I look at rocks. And so let's see what's pretty obvious for all of us. So first off, after the flood, you would expect to see layers and layers and layers of sediment. Because if the world was covered in water for around a year, every wave that passed by full of debris and dirt and mud and fine rocks, sand, big rocks, is going to be, huge waves over the whole Earth. You're going to be putting down layer and layer of sediment over everything. So what would you would expect that from a worldwide flood. And that is what we see. Now, evolutionists and naturalists say that, over these millions of years, there were local floods here, and, there was a shallow sea over the whole western U.S., which is where I live, and probably shallow seas over much of the rest of the world, because we see from the strata of the rocks that, particularly in the lower strata of these layers, you see small sea creatures. And then as you work your way up, the animals get bigger, and you see more bones of creatures. And so you would see that with these shallow seas over the Earth, or you would see that with a worldwide flood. You also see the continents pulled apart after the flood. I think both viewpoints believe that there was one major continent. I've heard it termed Pangea. Apart, that the continents pulled apart. And you can look at a global map or a globe, and see kind of how Africa and South America kind of fit together. And you can see Europe and the northern part of Africa kind of tucked in between the Americas, and Australia kind of pulling down from by India and Africa. So you can see, you can imagine everything getting shifted apart, and that would have been either very slow, these gradual movements, or big deal earthquakes and shifting through a lot of tectonic activity. Also, what would you see? We're seeing in these fossil layers, well, actually, to make a fossil, how do you make a fossil? So you need a creature that's dead or just died, but it needs to be fully covered in sediment or mud, and it has to be fairly quick, because if, say, you have a dead animal out exposed too long, some other scavenger is going to come along and eat it. And we find lots of intact fossils of full creatures, and so you pretty much need to cover that animal quickly. And I've even seen fossils where you have a fish eating another fish, and it is covered so quickly that it didn't even finish eating the fish before it was stopped in its tracks and died. So you got to cover things in sediment pretty quickly. And then what's going to happen is you need water that has minerals dissolved in it to go through that organic matter, and you're basically replacing the organic matter with minerals, and you basically make a rock hardened it's characteristic of the original animal. And we do see sea creatures on the bottom, and we see the bigger creatures on the top. We see sea creatures, though, on the tops of mountaintops, like Mount Everest has shells and things on that. In our neighborhood, we have a hill, and at the top of that hill, there's rocks that are exposed, and you see shells and all sorts of sea life in those, and we're a mile high. Now, also from science class, it was always that it takes millions of years to create a fossil. Well, that's not true. Actually, in a lab anymore, they're able to use a dead critter and heat and pressure, and they can make a fossil in a matter of days, and it is indistinguishable from the real deal that you would dig up in a rock. So, so depending on the conditions, you can make a fossil much more quickly. Now, at my kids, we did a merit badge up at the Mammoth site years ago, and the archaeologist who was running the class, shared with us how a fossil is technically greater than 10,000 years. So he passed around this fossilized bird nest, and we all thought, yeah, it's a fossil. It's it's all stone, but you could see all the detail of the nest. And this nest happened to be 3 years old. Where they're at, they have a lot of hot springs activity, and he must have put this nest out, and then 3 years later he went retrieved it, and it was all rock. So, depending on your conditions, you can make a fossil much more quickly. Also, with the different layers, sea creatures on the bottom, larger animals on the top, as flood waters are coming up, larger animals are going to have more opportunity to run and escape the rising water than the little creatures. So it's not unexpected. You would see sea creatures first, and then see more of them as things are swishing around, and then the larger creatures on the higher layers of rock. And then after the flood, the world is trying to recover from this catastrophic event. And we know that there was at least one ice age. I believe there's one. Other scientists will say there are multiple ones, but can't agree exactly on how many. But let's just say there was one major ice age after the flood. Growing up in the Midwest, we had glaciers, and we benefited from the glaciers coming through and basically flattening things out, depositing a nice rich layer of soil over the area of great for farming. And you could see where the glaciers had been and where the glaciers had not been because of the terrain and if you had hills and rocks versus farmland. So one other thing that we see that is evidence, you could say, against a 6,000-year-old Earth is the tree rings of bristlecone pines. They have found tree rings, which you have one each year, that shows that some bristlecone pines, really ancient ones, have rings as many as like 15,000 rings. So that says, oh well, you can't have a global flood, and a 6,000-year-old oak when you've got these tree rings that are 15,000 years old, or 15,000 rings. Well, my thought on this is that with this world that is trying to adapt to from going from fully tropical to cold at the poles and warm at the equator, and seasons that are now more extreme because of the firmament being gone, that at least for a while you could potentially have multiple rings created in the same year. Now that's not going to be happening anymore, but for the first few hundred years after the flood, if not even 1,000 years, you could be having many more rings per year. That's my take on that. So that is an evidence, though, that is used against a young Earth. Although even 15,000 years in the big span of things, that's a whole lot closer to a young Earth than an old Earth. So take that for what it's worth. So what else do we see in geology? We see these rock layers. Now some of these layers, they call them formations too, are found not just in a small geographic area. Some are found across whole continents, even from the US to other continents, some going all the way to Europe. The same strata are found in both places. So these are covering huge regions. So say if you want that it's from a small sea, a small shallow sea that covered the western US or other parts of the world, but sure looks to me like a flood that covers the world would be a better explanation for that. Another thing that is found in the fossil record and in all these different layers are something that are called polystrate fossils. And these aren't ones that, this is a term used by creationists. It's not really used by the scientific community. I'm sure they have their own term. But this is basically where you have a tree that is fossilized, and it is going vertically through many, many layers. And so, I printed out a few from the internet. You can just look up polystrate fossils and find photos. And, they're found all over the world. Not huge numbers of them, but significant numbers enough that, it's not a rare occurrence. And, the explanation from a naturalist point of view is that, the layers that are on this tree were deposited quickly in a local flood. But what if those layers are also ones that are found, hundreds or thousands of miles away? Makes it difficult to swallow that local flood. Another interesting thing from what you see, in the different layers of rock is sometimes you see bends. And I've got, a few pictures I printed out from the internet that, I don't know where exactly all these folks or places are at and where they were done. But, this one has basically a right angle that the rock layers take, and it doesn't show cracking at the bend, which implies that that layer of sediment was soft at the time so that it could have a chance to reshape under the pressure into a continuous line that has a bend. Sometimes there's this one that, basically is a W or a U or two circles next to one another. And I think probably if, you think about what you see on the layers of rock, and I've definitely have seen this in the Grand Canyon, for the most part, they're very flat and smooth, but you've seen places where that's not the case, that the layers do bend. Another thing about the Grand Canyon, we've hiked down into it, is that those layers are extremely flat and you don't see any erosion between them, not significant amounts of erosion, which you would expect if they're deposited over a long period of time, that wind and weather and animals digging and whatever would have disturbed those layers, such that you would see, and even earthquakes and things like that would sort of bend them out of shape. But there's really no slumping, no big cracks in them. When the ground dries out here, we get these big cracks in the ground. We don't see that in these layers. They're just, one right on top of another, consistent, thicknesses, and very even. So looking at that, it just looks to me like the evidence really points to a worldwide flood, much more so than deposited over millions of years. So I have traveled to the Grand Canyon. I've traveled to Mount St. Helens. And just in those 38 years or so since Mount St. Helens erupted, canyons have formed there that look a whole lot like what you see in the Grand Canyon. We had our own flood locally here in 2013, and we had our own little Grand Canyon formed on the route I take through town all the time. It's right by the river, and it had flowed over the road, and then it got cut out because the water kept going, and you end up with a little canyon. Also, getting back to the Mount St. Helens, I know of rocks that they had gotten from the eruption and had them radiocarbon dated, and they came back as several million years old. But they knew that these rocks were only 15, 20 years old at the time. So that gets back to that radiocarbon dating issue I had with my biology teacher way back in high school. But I digress. Another thing that's interesting about the flood is that pretty much every culture of the world has some sort of flood story in it. And it varies culturally. It's not all exactly Noah and the family and the ark, but there's consistent things. There's a flood. There's a guy and a small family takes the animals in a boat, and they survive when everybody else doesn't. So, take that for what it is, but it seems like the oral history and folklore passed down through the generations. That was a big event. Also, dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, the term doesn't show up in the Bible, but that's not surprising, since the term dinosaur means terrible lizard and was coined in the 1800s. So the Bible was written long before that. So, you don't see the term, but you do see a couple of behemoth, and you see the word Leviathan. Behemoth's a land, what could easily be construed as a dinosaur, and Leviathan, a water creature, both very dangerous to the people who are talking about them. So you hear about them in Job, you hear about them in Isaiah, talk about Leviathan, and I think it's just Job talks about behemoth. But dinosaur-like creatures, and you could say are in the Bible. So, at some point after the flood, those animals died, or those dinosaurs died off. But what we see for fossils of dinosaurs would be things that died in the flood. I've also heard, I haven't seen these in particular, but I would like to get to Glen Rose, Texas. I've heard that there are dinosaur footprints and human footprints in the same rock layers. Like to see it, can't confirm that, but interesting thought. The other thing, the scheme of thought these days also is that birds evolved from dinosaurs. So you should see in the fossil record, birds aft on top of dinosaurs. But yet, just read recently that they'd found a very modern bird-like structure of a fossil mixed in with dinosaur fossils. And so, this new revelation then makes them have to change the whole timeline of dinosaurs and birds and all of that. But, you never hear about that in science class, that they have to keep redoing the timeline all the time because of a new find. So, another, just call it a concern with how fossils are treated. Okay, so let's take a look at astronomy. Now, astronomy is used as one of these proofs of the universe being 13 billion years old. Because true, we do see starlight from stars that are millions and billions of light years away from the Earth. So that looks pretty obvious that the Earth is that old. But it is interesting that God specifically had a number of writers in the Old Testament describe the creation of the, well, not the creation of the stars, but that the universe was stretched out, the heavens were stretched out, or spread out, depending on which verse you're in particular looking at. So for instance, like if there's Job 9:8 or Isaiah 42, 44, 45, and 51, it's all described as stretching out the heavens. Jeremiah 10:12. And Jeremiah 51:15 and Zechariah 12:10. Or Zechariah 12:1. So let me just read one of those here. He has made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom and has stretched out the heavens at his discretion. So he obviously wanted ancient people who were reading and writing these chapters of the Bible to reinforce that idea that God stretched out the heavens. So, if say you have a thing of clay and you have a big wad and you're pulling it apart, you're stretching it out. If it's soft enough, you can pull it apart. And you can envision starlight then tracking the star and filling in that space of however many light years apart the Earth may be from that star. So, it's also, space is kind of described as a tent or a fabric. So now we hear astronomers describing the fabric of space. Well, who really coined that term? Was it Isaiah or was it modern astronomers? And they're talking about, a piece of cloth as the way space operates. Just a thought. Anyway, another thing about astronomy is there's a term for where the life zone, so to speak, around a sun. And Earth is clearly in what's called this Goldilocks zone, where all the conditions are just right for life to occur. So, you've got to be a distance from the sun, you've got to be a certain size, you've got to have a moon that's pretty big, that's in a stable orbit around the Earth to give us seasons and stabilize our tides and things like that. It also makes the moon is also perfect in a number of ways, but just one of them is it's perfect in the sense that when we have a solar eclipse, the moon just perfectly covers the sun, and you can observe the sun during that solar eclipse in ways that you can't really do it at any other time. And so, it makes our world ideal for observation. God wants us to use science to observe his creation. And so you have this world, this Earth, that has a lot of water. We wouldn't be able to survive if we didn't have as much water on Earth as we have today. There was an author who described Earth as the privileged planet. He was from my alma mater, and the scientific community wanted to eat him alive and take his tenure away because he wrote this book that is contrary to the millions and billions of years viewpoint. That is, I don't know that he said it, but a young Earth. And that was so contrary to the established science that was the mantra of the scientific community, that if you varied from that, if you questioned that in any way, you were ostracized. And we see it today in politics. The same sort of thing happens. You have the dominant media, and if you're a conservative and you have Fox News, that's about all you got. You're ostracized if you want to bring up things that are contrary to the dominant viewpoint. So why would, science is supposed to be neutral it's just that go where the data leads you. Well, not necessarily. It's all politicized, but I digress. All right, so got stable seasons, water. We have this perfectly inhabitable world. Now, not a chemist, but what I do know about the building blocks of human life are these amino acids, necessary for life. Try to make them in a lab, can't do it. But the water on our Earth and the oxygen on our Earth are both really problematic for making these initial building blocks of life. And so you have the need for water to live, but it being contrary to the formation of these amino acids in the initial stages of how life was believed to have come about. So, and like I said, not a chemist, but just what I have read. I'm just kind of paraphrasing from what I remember from it, but difficult to articulate well. But a problem for early primitive primordial soup design of the earth to create life. So let's touch on a couple things about biology. I had this stellar biology teacher in high school, so everything I know about biology basically I read after his class, and nothing from his class. But I do know about ecosystems, and there are many ecosystems all around the world where the plants, the animals, the trees, the amount of water, the environment, the climate, all has to work together to make it be an effective ecosystem. And things aren't going to survive unless all the pieces are there. Similar kind of thing to male and female. Now granted, male and female is getting pretty blurred these days, but genetically speaking, you gotta have a male, you gotta have a female, you gotta have egg, sperm to create life. So how are you going to get all those parts on both males and females all evolved to the same place that they're functioning and still be able to procreate and continue the species? And that male and female is so predominant in the animal world, nearly everything reproduces that way. And even in the plant kingdom, you have trees that are male and female trees, or you have on the same plant, you have male organs and female organs, pollen and seeds and all that are two genders. Biology, wants to keep things fresh, let's just say. So just seems like a pretty difficult thing to evolve to genders. Also, common anatomy. That leads to looking at, you can define that as being something God put in place, or that's through evolution. But whether you've got arms and you've got fins or you've got wings, the bone structure of those same sort of structures looks very similar across all of it. You can claim it's through common ancestry, or you can claim it's through a common creator. I'm going to go with a common creator. And I think I mentioned earlier about one kind of animal adopting another kind of animal, and how counter to evolution that is. So that's actually pretty radical in and of itself. Then there's also, we have life. Our bodies are living, but where did our consciousness come from? Where we're self-aware of ourselves. Developing language and mannerisms and all of the things that make us human. Where did all that come from? That's just not a basic biology thing popping out of nowhere. And as humans, the consciousness, but also a conscience, meaning our understanding of right and wrong. We understand that killing another human being is wrong, but in the animal kingdom, that's survival of the fittest. So, we consider that right and wrong. Our conscience says that. Also, there's, this mitochondrial DNA, and it's just, I've read about this, and I'm not an expert, but what I have seen is that, tracking mitochondrial DNA through the mother leads to, in world populations, 3 sort of distinct groups of people, clusters, so to speak, of genetic clusters of people. And, could that be from Noah's sons and their 3 wives, is where the source of those 3 groups tend to be from. In our community, we used to have a hardware store, and they're defunct now, but it was called Builder Square. And we were doing a reno of our house. And they had a tagline on their ads: you can special order anything. And so, hey, we believed it. Let's special order a couple. We only needed to order a couple of things for our house that they didn't have stocked. And we learned that, it wasn't necessarily you could special order anything, but you could special order anything given enough time. So we believed that for a while, and then we learned that, even special ordering something given enough time or enough iterations on trying to get it right, it still wasn't possible to do that. And evolution is a little bit like that. If we wait long enough, it's surely going to turn into something good. Well, the laws of entropy, things that say things break down, things don't actually get better. Same is true of DNA. DNA it's basically a language of biology, and you don't gain more DNA information, you don't gain more language of biology by mutations. It only gets worse, it doesn't get better. So, I see that as another, you can't really say proof. There is no way to prove long Earth history or 6,000 years. You can't prove it one way or another. Also, there's a question of, if God had the ability to put the world together and then wait 13 billion years to let everything evolve, and randomly choose what was going to pop out. It's the question of why would he? Why would he wait? If he had the ability to do it quickly, whether the snap of a finger or 6 days to set up a structure for us to live, why would you wait? Just seems kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't you want to go quick? Also, from a science standpoint, I'm kind of jumping around here, I realize that. There's observational science, and I've done that all, through my career, where you make hypotheses, you test that out, and you prove either this or that was the case, so it's true or false, setting up experiments and doing the scientific method. And, whether you're a creationist or whether you're an evolutionist, I think we all agree on the way science happens. Now, we can agree on that. We can agree on natural selection of, animals that are better adapted to an environment will survive. We can agree on that. Where we diverge is on historical science. So where are origins at? It's really about our origins. And there's the saying, the present is key to the past. Well, if you take the flood story, what happened pre-flood doesn't look a whole lot like what happened post-flood. So the key to the past isn't necessarily the present. And there's plenty of evidence to say that things haven't been behaving the same way all along, but I won't go into that. And just when you hear people say the science is settled, that's a huge red flag for me. You never hear gravity. The science is settled about gravity. Well, no, because we can observe it and it's repeatable, and so we can test that. These other things that the science is settled seem to be not so settled. And they'd like to say that the age of the Earth being millions of years old, 4 million years old, the age of the universe 13 billion years old, that's all settled science. Well, see that as a red flag. So ultimately, you can believe either one. It is a belief system, whichever you believe. But it really comes down to whose authority are you trusting? Are you trusting the Word of God from the Bible and from, through the 66 books and authors over time? Or are you trusting what man comes up with and then regularly changes? Because the age of the earth and the age of the universe is been a moving target. And who's to say that it truly is settled at 13 point whatever billion years old? I'm going to go with God's word. And I'd encourage you to do the same.